Have you ever had that feeling when you're walking up the basement stairs in the dark and your skin prickles because you're absolutely certain that if you turn around, something is standing just an inch away from your heels? Scientists call it preparedness theory. They say it's an evolutionary leftover from when our ancestors were being hunted by big cats in the tall grass. They say it's a glitch in your survival instinct, but they're wrong. It's not a glitch. It's a leak. Your brain isn't imagining a threat. It's briefly losing the ability to filter one out. My name is Elias, and for 12 years I worked as a structural forensic investigator. My job was simple. When a building collapsed or a house started to sink without a clear geological cause, I was the guy the insurance company sent to find out why. I've seen everything. I've seen black mold that looked like it was breathing. I've seen dry rot that turned a multi-million-dollar mansion into a pile of toothpicks in 6 months. But what I found at a small, nameless town in upstate New York 3 years ago, that wasn't rot. It wasn't structural failure. It was the beginning of the end of the world, as I understood it. It started with a claim from a woman named Clara. She lived in a colonial-style house built in the late 40s. The complaint was weird, even for my standards. She didn't say the floor was sagging or the walls were cracking. She said the geometry was changing. Those were her exact words. She said that every morning when she woke up, her bedroom felt slightly narrower. She said she started measuring the distance between her nightstand and the closet, and every day it was losing 1/8 of an inch, not because the furniture was moving, but because the floor space itself was evaporating. I took the job thinking it was a classic case of a shifting foundation, or maybe early onset schizophrenia. I arrived on a Tuesday. The house looked normal from the curb white siding, black shutters, a neatly mown lawn. But the moment I stepped over the threshold, my inner ear did a somersault. You know that feeling when an elevator drops too fast? That's what the air inside that house felt like. It was heavy and it smelled like ozone and wet copper. Clara was thin, her eyes bloodshot and darting. She didn't offer me coffee. She just pointed to the hallway and whispered, "It's hungry, Elias. It's eating the distance." I pulled out my Leica laser distance meter, a high-end tool that's accurate to the millimeter. I aimed it at the far wall of the hallway, 12.04 feet. I waited 60 seconds and pressed the button again, 12.02 feet. My heart skipped. Lasers don't lie. Foundations don't move 2 centimeters in a minute without the house screaming in agony from the stress. But this house was silent. There was no creaking wood, no snapping nails. The space was just shrinking. I went into the basement thinking maybe the main load-bearing beam was warping. I flicked on my flashlight, and that's when I saw the first glitch. In the far corner of the cellar, where 2 concrete walls met the ceiling, the angle wasn't 90 degrees anymore. It was rounded, but not like a curve. It looked like the reality of the corner was being blurred out, like a low-resolution texture in a video game that failed to load. I reached out to touch it, and my hand didn't hit concrete. It hit something that felt like cold, pressurized air. My fingers disappeared into the blur. I couldn't feel them. There was no pain, just a terrifying sense of nothingness. I pulled my hand back, and for a split second, my fingertips were translucent. I could see the beam of my flashlight through my own fingernails. That's when the sound started. It wasn't a roar or a scream. It was a rhythmic, wet thrum, like a massive heart beating inside a vat of oil. Thump, squish, thump, squish. It was coming from the walls. I realized then that the house wasn't a building anymore. It had been hijacked. Something was using the structure of the home as a skeleton for a biological process that didn't belong in our dimension. I ran back upstairs to find Clara, but she wasn't in the kitchen. I followed the sound of the thrumming to her bedroom. The door was ajar. I pushed it open and stopped dead. The room was barely 5 feet wide now. The bed was being crushed, the wood frames snapping like dried twigs. Clara was standing in the center of the room, staring at the ceiling, or where the ceiling used to be. The plaster had dissolved into a swirling, iridescent oil. It looked like the surface of a bubble, shimmering with colors that don't exist in the rainbow. And descending from that oily film were thin, vibrating filaments, thousands of them, like the tentacles of a jellyfish, but made of pure light. They were wrapped around Clara's head. They weren't hurting her. They were sampling her. Her eyes were rolled back. and she was whispering a sequence of numbers over and over again. I grabbed her arm to pull her out, but the moment I touched her, I saw it. I saw what she was seeing. Imagine a city made of shadows and glass, where the buildings are miles high and the sky is a bruised purple. Imagine creatures the size of mountains drifting through the air like deep-sea whales, their bodies pulsating with the same rhythmic thrum I heard in the walls. They weren't monsters. They were the architects. They were the ones who built the simulation we call reality, and they were here to harvest the raw data. We aren't people to them. We are just code. We are the software running on their hardware, and the house was a bad sector on the hard drive. They were deleting it. I lost my grip on Clara as the floor beneath us began to tilt, not because the house was falling, but because down was no longer a constant direction. Gravity was failing. I watched as Claire's dresser floated toward the ceiling, shattering against the oily film and disappearing into the iridescent swirl without a sound. Clara looked at me one last time. Her face was calm, too calm. "It's not a death, Elias," she said, her voice sounding like it was coming from a mile away. "It's an update." Then the filaments tightened. Clara was pulled upward, her body stretching in a way that should have torn her in half. But she just turned into a long, thin ribbon of white light and was sucked into the ceiling. The room slammed shut. The walls met in the middle, scrambled back into the hallway just as the bedroom door vanished. There was no door anymore, just a flat, seamless wall of white siding where a room had been seconds ago. I stumbled toward the front door, but the hallway was growing longer now. For every step I took forward, the floor seemed to stretch 2 steps back. I was running on a treadmill made of space-time. The thrumming got louder, vibrating in my teeth, making my vision blur. The wall started to bleed, not blood, but a thick gray static. It looked like the snow on an old TV screen, but it was physical. It was falling from the wallpaper like sand. Everywhere it touched, the house dissolved. The carpet turned into gray dust. The drywall turned into vapor. I looked behind me. The back of the house was gone. There was just a yawning abyss of that bruised purple sky and those mountain-sized architects drifting in the distance. I realized I was standing on the last remaining fragment of a dying world. I reached for the front door handle, but my hand passed right through it. The door was just an image now, a hologram. I fell to my knees, the gray static covering my legs. I felt the nothingness starting to creep up my shins. It didn't feel cold. It didn't feel like anything. It was just the absence of sensation. I was being uninstalled. I closed my eyes and screamed, but no sound came out. My lungs were no longer moving air because the air was no longer there. And then, total silence. I woke up on the front lawn. The sun was shining. The birds were chirping. I looked back at the house. It was gone. Not burned down, not collapsed. Just, there was a perfect rectangular hole in the earth where the foundation should have been. The grass at the edges was cut as clean as if a laser had done it. There was no debris, no pipes, no wires. Just a pit of raw, brown dirt. I sat there for hours, waiting for someone to notice. But nobody did. Neighbors drove by and didn't even look at the empty lot. It was as if the house had never existed in their version of the world. When I checked my Leica meter, the screen was blank. When I checked my phone, Clara's contact was gone. Even the call logs were wiped. I thought I was safe. I thought I had escaped the deletion. But that night, when I got back to my apartment in the city, I went to wash my face. I looked in the bathroom mirror, and I didn't see my reflection. I saw the bathroom. I saw the shower curtain behind me. I saw the towel rack. But where I should have been standing, there was just a hole in the image, a bad sector. I reached out to touch the mirror, and my hand didn't hit glass. It went straight through. And on the other side, I heard it. A soft, rhythmic thrum. Thump, squish. Thump, squish. Thump, squish. The harvest isn't over. It's just moving to a larger scale. I stood there in my bathroom, staring at the space where my reflection should have been. My hand was buried 6 inches deep into the silver surface of the mirror, and I felt nothing. No cold glass, no resistance, just that pressurized, dead air. My apartment began to hum a low-frequency vibration that rattled my molars. The thrum was back, but this time it wasn't coming from the walls. It was coming from inside my own chest. I pulled my hand back. It was flickering. My skin was losing its resolution, turning into a grainy, pixelated mess of gray static and raw light. I looked down at my feet. The bathroom tiles were starting to unrender, revealing a vast geometric abyss beneath the floorboards. I wasn't falling because gravity had become a suggestion rather than a law. I was simply drifting in a collapsing simulation. I realized then that the house in upstate New York wasn't the target. I was the target. By witnessing the update, by seeing the architects, I had become a corrupted file in their system. I was a witness to the backstage of reality, and the universe's immune system was finally responding. I bolted for the front door, but my apartment was stretching. The hallway that usually took 5 seconds to cross now felt like a mile of shifting, kaleidoscopic architecture. The walls weren't made of plaster anymore. They were made of scrolling strings of iridescent light, a language that my brain tried to translate but couldn't. It felt like my mind was being force-fed a terabyte of data through a dial-up connection. My nose started to bleed. Not red blood, but a glowing neon blue fluid that floated upward in perfect spheres. "Elias," a voice echoed. It wasn't a human voice. It sounded like 1,000 glass panes shattering simultaneously, yet it was perfectly clear. The observation must be closed. You are an open loop. I reached the door and yanked it open. I expected to see the familiar hallway of my building, the flickering fluorescent lights and the smell of stale trash. Instead, I stepped out into a void. I was standing on a floating fragment of my own living room, drifting through that bruised purple sky I had seen in Clara's house. Below me, the city was being dismantled. It looked like a massive digital grave. Whole blocks of Manhattan were being lifted into the air, dematerializing into streams of gray dust that flowed toward the mountain-sized architects. They were harvesting the city. They were folding the three-dimensional world into something else, something flat and efficient. Thousands of people were being sucked upward, turning into those thin ribbons of white light. No screaming, no panic, just a silent, orderly deletion. I saw a man drifting near me, clutching a briefcase. He was still looking at his watch, checking the time for a meeting that no longer existed in the world that was being deleted. As I watched, his arm began to stretch, growing longer and thinner until it looked like a piece of pulled taffy. He didn't even notice. He just vanished into the iridescent film above us. "Why?" I screamed into the void. "Why us?" The architect nearest to me shifted. It was so large that its movement created a shockwave of pressurized air that nearly knocked me off my floating carpet. It didn't have a face, but I felt its attention lock onto me. "Complexity is expensive." The voice shattered in my head. "The simulation has reached its heat death. We are reclaiming the energy. We are optimizing. Optimizing." That was the word for the end of the human race. We weren't a tragedy. We were an overhead cost. We were a bloated piece of software that was taking up too much processing power. I looked around for a way out, but there is no exit when the out is being deleted. I saw my own memories manifesting in the void around me. I saw my mother's kitchen from 20 years ago, flickering like a dying light bulb. I saw my first car, a rusted-out Ford, parked on a cloud of gray static. They were scraping my hard drive. Everything I had ever been was being uploaded into the architect's collective, leaving me as an empty shell. I felt a sudden sharp pain in my eyes. I looked at my hands again. They were gone. Not invisible, just gone. The deletion had reached my torso. I was a floating head and a pair of shoulders, drifting toward the shimmering, oily film that now covered the entire horizon. But then, I saw it. A glitch. In the middle of the bruised purple sky, there was a tear. It wasn't iridescent and it wasn't static. It was a jagged, ugly hole of pure, blinding white. It looked like a crack in a screen. And through that crack, I saw something that didn't belong to the architects. I saw a world that was messy, dirty, and chaotic. I saw rain hitting a windshield. I saw a dog barking at a fence. I saw the real world, the one the simulation was trying to imitate. I realized that the architects didn't build the universe. They built a replica. We were living in a high-fidelity copy, a digital terrarium designed to study the soul. And the replica was being shut down because the study was over. I used the last of my will to propel myself toward that tier. I wasn't moving my muscles. I was moving my intent. I focused every scrap of my identity, every memory they hadn't scraped yet, into a single point of momentum. The loop must be closed, the architect boomed. 1,000 filaments of light lashed out at me, trying to snag my consciousness, to pull me back into the harvest. They wrapped around my throat, tasting my fear, sampled my desperation. I felt my ego starting to dissolve. I was forgetting my name. I was forgetting the taste of coffee. I was forgetting the feeling of the sun on my skin. No, I thought, I'm Elias Thorne. I'm a structural forensic investigator. I find the cracks. And I found one. I collided with the white tear just as the architect's filaments tightened. There was a sound like a million bells ringing at once. A flash of pain so intense it felt like my soul was being scrubbed with sandpaper. And then, cold, wet, hard. I woke up face down in the mud. I could hear the sound of real wind, not the rhythmic thrum of the chaotic whistling wind of a storm. I could smell the scent of pine and rotting leaves. I opened my eyes and saw a gray sky. Not purple, gray. I tried to stand up, but my body felt heavy, impossibly heavy. I looked at my hands. They were covered in blood and dirt. They weren't flickering. They were solid. They were real. I was in the woods. I looked back at where I had come from, expecting to see the tear in the sky. But there was nothing, just a stand of old-growth oak trees and the pouring rain. I wandered for hours until I found a road. It was a cracked asphalt mess covered in potholes. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. A car pulled over an old beat-up Chevy truck. The driver was a man with a beard and a flannel shirt. He looked at me with genuine concern. "Son, you look like you've been through a war," he said. "You need a lift." I got in the truck. I touched the dashboard. It was dusty. It was imperfect. It was dusty. It was imperfect. It was real. I looked in the side view mirror. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, I saw myself. I looked older. My hair was streaked with white, but I was there. "Where are we?" I asked, my voice rasping. "About 20 miles outside of Bangor, Maine," the driver said. "You okay? You're shaking." "I'm fine," I whispered. "I'm just glad to be in the original," the driver laughed. "The original? Man, you talk like a city boy. This is just the world." I stayed in a motel that night. I watched the news. No reports of missing cities. No mention of Manhattan being harvested. The world was going on as it always had: wars, weather, sports, politics. I realized that the update hadn't happened to the real world. It had happened to the server I was living on. I'd escaped the simulation just as they turned off the lights. But here's the thing that keeps me awake at night. Here's the reason I don't look at the sky anymore. A week ago, I was sitting in a diner drinking a cup of coffee. I looked at the wall and I saw a shadow. It wasn't my shadow. It wasn't my shadow. It was a rounded, blurred-out angle where two walls met the ceiling. I pulled out a laser pointer I'd bought at a hardware store. I aimed it at the wall, 10:05 feet. I waited 60 seconds, 10:03 feet. My heart stopped. I looked at the waitress. She was smiling and pouring coffee for a regular. But as she turned away, I saw it. For a split second, her eyes didn't move with her head. They stayed locked on me, vibrating with a high-frequency hum. They're here too. The architects didn't just build one simulation. They built them in layers, like a Russian nesting doll of realities. I didn't escape to the real world. I just escaped to a larger server, one with more processing power, one that's a little more convincing, a little more dirty, but the heat death is coming here too. The optimization is inevitable. I looked in the diner mirror as I left. My reflection was there, but it was 3 seconds behind. It watched me walk to the door. It watched me leave. And then it smiled. If you're listening to this, you're still in the loop. You think your life is your own. You think your memories are safe. But check the corners of your room. Measure the distance between your bed and the door. And if you ever feel that prickle on the back of your neck when you're walking up the stairs in the dark, don't turn around. They're just sampling the data, and they're almost done with yours.